This is Black Thought. I'm your host, Dr. Hutchinson, and we have a familiar face with us, Mr. Walter Fields, the executive editor of the North Star News. And we're glad to have you this evening, brother.
Thank you for having me as always.
Now, we're not here to talk about national events. We're not here to talk about what's happening up in New Jersey. We're not here to talk about Memphis. We're here to talk about something that's kind of personal. And I think you're probably the best person to frame it, and then we can critique it afterward. This is something that happened involving your daughter. Tell us what happened.
Well, my daughter is a 15-year-old sophomore at our local high school here in Maplewood, New Jersey, Columbia High School. And recently, on her lunch break, she went across the street to a local pizzeria with one of her good friends, who's also 15-year-old African-American female. And as she walked into the pizzeria, she had her home-prepared lunch with her in her hand. And the restaurant worker said, well, we don't allow you to eat food that's not purchased from this restaurant inside the restaurant. So my daughter said, oh, that's not a problem. And she put her lunch in her backpack. Meanwhile, her friend went to go purchase lunch from the pizzeria counter. Within, a minute, the pizzeria owner turns around and starts berating my daughter, telling her that she needs to leave the restaurant. And my daughter is really perplexed because she hasn't done anything wrong. And this pizzeria owner, in the middle of this crowded lunch hour, packed with my daughter's friends from this high school, which is directly across the street from the high school, diagonally on the corner, he eventually says, well, I'm going to call the police. And my daughter says, I haven't done anything, so I will wait for the police to arrive. And so the police arrived, and when they arrived, my daughter calmly told the police officer, officer, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk to you outside because I don't want to cause a commotion. So she stepped outside the pizzeria with her friend and explained to the officer what had happened. All the officer did was take her name and address as by their processes, which they're supposed to do, their procedure. And my daughter walked back to the high school. Now, meanwhile, while this owner was berating my daughter, there were other students in the pizzeria, white males, who were just sitting around. They were not eating, and some were eating food that was not purchased by this establishment.
Wow.
So, of course, I'm livid because I don't believe that, number one, we should harass children in this way. But number two, criminalize children. And what I want everyone to understand is that my daughter is an AP honors student as a sophomore. She made honor roll every semester as a freshman. She was a varsity athlete as a freshman, two-sport varsity athlete. She's a starting point guard as a freshman on her high school basketball team. She is on the varsity track team. Columbia High School has the #1 rated girls track team in the nation. My daughter had the third best long jump in the state of New Jersey as a freshman and qualified for the New Balance National High School Championships in North Carolina last year. My daughter plays on the school band. She works part-time for the recreation department of our neighboring community, South Orange, New Jersey, in the fall, teaching young children how to play basketball. This is a model student and a model kid. And here we have a situation, and it could have been any child. It just happened to be my daughter, and that's why it's personal to me. But this is a classic example of how we can't allow this society criminalize our children in this way. If it had not been for the calmness of my daughter, it had not been for her knowing what to do in this situation, the outcome could have been totally different. If it had been a child who got upset, the police arrived, a scuffle breaks out, someone could have been hurt. And I want people to understand that if we don't stand up for our children, and if we don't protect our children, then we do give them over to society. And then we do allow the criminal justice system to take them. And folks should also know that when I spoke to the police department here, they commended my daughter on her behavior. They said she was not only polite, but respectful. I spoke to the officer who was on the scene that day. I spoke to the lieutenant on charge that day. And the internal affairs officer called me the next day to commend my daughter on her behavior. So here's a model kid who only wants to eat lunch with her friend. And this is what she goes through during the school day. So we are taking the steps right now to file a formal complaint, the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, under our public accommodation statute. We're also talking to the local NAACP branches in the area. My big issue here, my daughter is fine, but there's a bigger issue here. We have an anti-bullying law in New Jersey. And ironically, last week, our township had declared it a week of respect in recognition of the state's anti-bullying law. So in the week that we're having a week of respect and anti-bullying, my daughter gets bullied by an adult. And we need to understand that our children get bullied all the time, and not always by kids. They get bullied in the school by teachers. They get bullied in neighborhoods by residential owners, and they get bullied in local establishments by business owners. We have to draw the line and protect our children, because if we don't, not only do we leave them susceptible to the criminal justice system, but we also begin to lose their respect, because they need us to stand up as adults. And that's all I'm doing in this instance. Not trying to be sort of the person I've been in civil rights, but I'm being a father. This is my child. And I think we need to understand that as fathers in particular, we have got to stand up for our sons and daughters.
I agree, and several things jumped out at me. First of all, some of what you said is quantifiable. You know, the acumen of your daughter, what she's done in school, what she's done in terms of extracurricular activities. Those are quantifiable things. What the police officers have said. So this is not the musings of a parent who's upset because of what happened to his daughter. These things are quantifiable. This young lady handled herself well, and because of how you've equipped her, she also understood conflict resolution. Because as you said, let me put it this way. If that had been me at her age, far different outcome. Even though I was equipped, you know, my parents taught me well, it would have been a different outcome if that owner had tried to bully me in that way. Totally different.
Well, you're absolutely right.
I would have had some handcuffs on me. I'm certain of that, and that happens all the time. Go right ahead. I'm sorry.
But, no, you're absolutely right, and I think that's what the folks in this town who know our family, who know my daughter, are equally outraged. And we live in a predominantly white community. African Americans make up about 34% of Maplewood, New Jersey. But we've heard from our white neighbors who are just as appalled at the way my daughter's been treated. The other thing this episode has done, though, you know, when you have these incidents in these two towns that share a school district, Maplewood and South Orange, they pride themselves on being a diverse community. In fact, they really brag about the diversity in these two communities. But it's when you have an incident like this that you begin to see all the ugliness that hides behind the doors and the nice homes and the manicured lawns. So this story was published in our local online newspaper, the Maplewood Patch. And the comments that were made were so atrocious, and many of them so racist. And, you know, what I've tried to explain to my daughter is that, you know, God uses you in different ways. And sometimes you're called to do something that you don't even realize the purpose. And so part of what we're up against in America today is fighting the racism that we can't see. You know, there was a song that, you know, we communicated about, Smiling Faces, from back in the 70s.
That's right.
And the song is so apropos today, because where we don't see the outward forms of racism that we saw in the 60s, people are still racist and they hide their biases. And if an incident like this begins to expose people for who they are. So in many ways, this is a healthy exercise, because it allows us to see in a way that we wouldn't see otherwise. And so we're trying to do something constructive with this. I've actually been in touch with the state senator who wrote the anti-bullying law. She's an old friend, as Senator Valerie Huddle from Bergen County, New Jersey. And we had a long discussion. So now we're talking about, do we need to look at modifying this law to protect students outside the school building, but not from other students, but from local merchants or adults who could be within 1,000 feet of the school, like we do with our drug-free school zones in New Jersey. 1,000 feet from the school, if you're arrested selling drugs, the penalties are higher. Well, do we need to implement something similar for bullying? Because as much as people talk about young people being disrespectful, most of our young people are very respectful, and most of them will never challenge authority, even when the authority is wrong, because they've been raised in such a way that they fear authority. My daughter just happens to be a child who has a sense of herself because that's what she's been taught, and acted calmly. She actually called me while this was unfolding. So she
Wow.
called me on her cell phone, and she said, Dad, they're calling the police on me. I just said, Jordan, just, be calm. You haven't done anything wrong. You know what to do, and I'll deal with it after school. And that's exactly what we did. And I hung up the phone. I was home. I'm 5 minutes away from that pizzeria. But I purposely did not go to the establishment because the other lesson that I want to teach young people is that you yourself have rights and that you have to stand up for yourself. We learned that lesson when we were growing up.
Exactly.
This generation really hasn't learned that lesson. So for her friends to see her in that moment is important too. Other young people need to see young people stand up for themselves in a very dignified and respectful way because that empowers another person along the way. So as awful as experience as this was for my daughter in the moment, we're trying to use it in a larger sense to be able to begin the process of building up our young people again. Because most of them have been torn down to the point that they don't feel as though they have any rights in those type of circumstances.
Exactly. And I think also, in addition to what you've said, I think that we have become lax in understanding that James Crow has taken a bath, cleaned up, and he's Dr. James Crow. So some of the issues that we have had as a people have not gone away, and it is still hazardous to have a permanent tan in America. Because think about this
Yes,
for a minute. In the suburbs, you become anesthetized sometimes to the fact that you're not looked upon the same until things like these happen. And then in the inner city, you have zoning, you have redlining, you have food deserts, you have other things that are insidious that you don't always readily see that are also subjugating you. So we're getting it on several levels. And we
that's
have to be
right.
clear on
And
that.
and I think in suburban communities, we've fallen prey to this false sense of security, and we've accepted sort of this false serenity and tranquility, where we don't want to raise issues because we don't want to rock the boat. I think many of us are more inclined to want to be accepted than to want to be respected. And so we live in these predominantly white suburban communities and we go along to get along because we don't want to be viewed as sort of the troublemaker. Meanwhile, injustices occur around us and disrespect occurs around us, and our children are harmed. And so we need to go back to what always worked for us, that when we saw injustice, we spoke out about it. And if necessary, we moved on that injustice. And that's what I'm trying to bring back in my community, a sense for the African American community that you have just as much right to be here as your white neighbors, and you have just as much right to demand respect as they do. And there is absolutely nothing wrong in raising issues of race when they are clear and apparent. And there's nothing wrong with raising issues of race if you think there are issues of race and they're not clear and apparent. We've gotten to the point that we've allowed folks to almost beat us down for even saying the word race. And it's gotten to the point now where we can't even have those discussions because, we're always criticized for playing the race card. And I have to remind people that's one card in a racial deck that we don't play.
That's right.
America has a race deck. We pull out the card that impacts us most, but
Mm,
they've got the deck.
that's right.
And we've got to remind people of that fact and go back to the day of calling people out. So we've also been trying to get people, My network of folks across the country have been good about calling this pizzeria owner and just expressing their outrage over the fact that he would treat a 15-year-old child in this manner. Because part of what we also want to make sure is that these individuals understand that our children also have their own support network and that they're not out here all alone.
Well, I'm glad that you went there because as we get ready to close this conversation, just in general, and just so you know, as we finish this interview, we will also post as a part of what you're seeing, viewers, the steps you can take to help this situation. But if you could just briefly cover it for us, that would be good. What can we do? Because it's not enough to just vent, but we have to do something.
Well, the first thing you can do is call this establishment, Maplewood Pizzeria. Their phone number is 973-378-8588. And to simply express your outrage that this local business establishment, this owner, would treat two 15-year-old girls in this manner. The second thing that you can do is post that message on your Facebook page or on Twitter to make it viral. We want to get as many phone calls as possible into this local business owner just to show that black children are supported by their community. Because I also think there's a sense among some people that our children are isolated and they don't have anyone in their corner. So we've been trying to show this business that yes, these girls certainly do have people in their corner. So if you call the pizzeria, Maplewood Pizzeria at 973-378-8588, and then if you would post that message on your Facebook page so that your Facebook friends can also make calls, that would be a tremendous help to us in this moment.
Well, Brother Fields, first of all, we want to thank you. We're sorry that this had to happen, but this may be the catalyst for some positive change.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate the time. And it once again, it's how we can use technology to stand up for our community and to stand up for our children.
Exactly. Well, this is Walter Fields, the executive editor of the North Star News. We're glad to have him. And you are watching Black Thought, and I'm your host, Dr. Hutchinson.